Somewhere in the Mauritanian desert, a truck the size of a small building crests a dune at speed, throwing up a wall of sand behind it, its massive tires barely touching the ground on the way down. The crowd watching from a checkpoint tent erupts. This truck, and the small handful like it entered by the same manufacturer, has just dominated one of the most brutal endurance races on the planet, the Dakar Rally, for what feels, by this point, like an entire era. Picture the scene a little more fully. Temperatures during the day can climb well past what most vehicles, let alone most human beings, are designed to comfortably tolerate. At night, the desert turns bitterly cold. Navigation depends on route notes and a compass rather than any paved road, because there is no paved road, only whatever the terrain happens to allow that day. Shifting dunes 1 hour, jagged volcanic rock the next, a dry riverbed the hour after that. Support crews and spare parts are, at any given moment, potentially hundreds of kilometers away. A single serious mechanical failure out here isn't just a lost race. It can mean a genuinely dangerous situation for the crew involved. This is the environment competitors have chosen to enter, year after year, fully aware of the risks, purely for the chance at victory. Competitors from wealthier, larger countries backed by bigger budgets keep entering the same race, year after year, and keep losing to the same name. That name is Tatra. And if you'd walked into this company's actual headquarters back in its home country around this exact same period, you would have found something almost impossible to reconcile with what you just watched in the desert. A company in genuine chaos, tangled in bitter boardroom disputes, cycling through owners, hemorrhaging money, and at several points, dangerously close to disappearing entirely. This is the story of a company that built some of the toughest, most technically ingenious vehicles the automotive world has ever produced. Trucks so capable that militaries and desert racers alike considered them nearly unbeatable, and that came within a hair's breadth of being destroyed, not by an outside enemy, not by a collapsing customer on the other side of a border, but by the very people who were supposed to be running it. To understand how a company can be simultaneously the best in the world at what it does, and also fighting for its own survival, we need to go back much further than the Cold War, much further even than the First World War, to a small wagon-building workshop in a Moravian town in the middle of the 19th century. In 1850, a company called Nesselsdorfer Wagenbau was founded in the town of Koprivnica, then part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, in a region known today as Moravia in the Czech Republic. Like so many of the companies we've covered on this channel, this began life building something that had absolutely nothing to do with what would eventually make it famous: horse-drawn wagons and carriages for regional transport and agriculture. But this particular workshop had an unusually early and unusually serious appetite for new technology. By the very end of the 19th century, as the automobile was still an experimental curiosity in most of the world, Nesselsdorfer Wagenbau was already building some of the earliest production automobiles anywhere in Europe, putting this company, remarkably, among the true pioneers of the entire automotive industry, decades before most of the manufacturers we associate with early car history had even begun operating. To put that pioneering status in real perspective, it helps to remember just how experimental the automobile still was at this point in history. Carl Benz had only patented his first motor car a handful of years earlier, in 1886, and for years afterward, automobiles remained rare, expensive, mechanically unreliable curiosities built in small numbers by a scattered handful of workshops across Europe, most of them located in Germany, France, and a few other Western European centers of engineering. For a wagon-building workshop in a relatively modest Moravian industrial town, far from the traditional centers of this new technology, to be among the very first anywhere producing actual running automobiles wasn't simply lucky timing. It reflected a genuine, unusually forward-looking engineering culture inside this particular company, one willing to abandon a perfectly viable, profitable existing business. Horse-drawn wagons were, after all, still very much in demand at the turn of the century, in favor of an unproven, expensive, mechanically temperamental new technology that most of the world hadn't yet decided to take seriously. This early automotive experimentation gave Nesselsdorfer Wagenbau, and later Tatra, a genuine head start in engineering expertise and manufacturing know-how that most of its eventual competitors, across multiple future decades, simply couldn't match. By the time other manufacturers across Central Europe were still treating automobiles as a promising sideline to more established businesses, this company already had a full generation's worth of accumulated hands-on experience actually building and refining them. When Czechoslovakia became an independent country in 1918, following the collapse of the Austro-Hungarian Empire at the end of the First World War, the company renamed itself Tatra, after the Tatra mountain range that forms a dramatic natural border within the new Czechoslovak state. It was a proud, deliberately national name for a new era, a company reinventing itself alongside the new country it now called home. And it's in these interwar decades that Tatra produced some of the most genuinely radical, forward-thinking engineering of the entire era, under the direction of a designer named Hans Ledwinka, whose name deserves to be far better known outside engineering circles than it currently is. Ledwinka pioneered a design philosophy built around a central steel backbone tube running the length of the vehicle, with the engine mounted at the rear and cooled by air rather than water, and independent suspension at each wheel rather than a single rigid axle. This sounds like a fairly ordinary list of features today, but in the 1930s, this combination was genuinely revolutionary. Hans Ledwinka himself is a figure who deserves a moment of real attention because his career arc says something important about how genuine engineering talent could flourish, even inside the relatively small, resource-constrained industrial base of interwar Czechoslovakia. Ledwinka had actually worked for the company, under its earlier Nesselsdorfer name, even before the First World War, developing a reputation as a meticulous, occasionally stubborn engineer who cared far more about solving a mechanical problem correctly than about following whatever design conventions happened to be fashionable at the time. He left the company for a period to work elsewhere in the automotive industry, absorbing new ideas circulating across Europe's still young automotive engineering community, before returning to lead Tatra's design efforts through what would become the company's most technically ambitious and influential period. The backbone chassis concept Ledwinka championed, a single, rigid, load-bearing central tube running the length of the vehicle, with the drivetrain components mounted directly to it, and the body itself acting almost like a lightweight shell wrapped around this structural spine, was a genuine departure from the conventional ladder-frame chassis most manufacturers of the era relied on. Combined with independent suspension at each wheel, rather than a single rigid axle connecting both wheels on one side of the vehicle, this design allowed each wheel to respond individually to bumps, ruts, and uneven terrain, rather than transmitting every jolt directly through to its paired wheel and, ultimately, to the passengers inside. The most famous product of this philosophy was the Tatra 77, introduced in 1934, widely regarded by automotive historians as one of the first seriously aerodynamic cars ever put into production anywhere in the world. Its smooth, teardrop-shaped body a radical departure from the boxy, flat-fronted cars of the era. This wasn't a curiosity built for a motor show. It was a genuine production vehicle, engineered around principles that wouldn't become mainstream in the wider automotive industry for decades. Here's a detail that tends to surprise people the first time they hear it, and it's worth lingering on because it says so much about how genuinely influential this small Czechoslovak company's engineering really was. A young engineer named Ferdinand Porsche, later responsible for one of the most famous cars in automotive history, the Volkswagen Beetle, is widely understood to have drawn heavily on Tatra's rear-engine, air-cooled design principles when developing his own people's car concept for Nazi Germany in the late 1930s. The resemblance between certain Tatra models of this period and the eventual Beetle is, by most honest engineering assessments, far too close to be coincidental. The rear-mounted, air-cooled engine, the rounded, aerodynamically informed body shape, the fundamental layout philosophy, all echo choices Tatra had already made and publicly demonstrated years earlier. There's a story, often repeated among automotive historians, that Adolf Hitler himself, upon viewing early Tatra designs, remarked admiringly on exactly the kind of car he wanted developed for ordinary German citizens. A detail that, if accurate, adds a particularly uncomfortable layer to this entire dispute, given everything that followed. Tatra's own leadership certainly believed the resemblance was more than coincidental and pursued the matter as a genuine patent dispute, filing legal claims arguing that fundamental, protected elements of their engineering had been copied without licensing or compensation. This legal fight was interrupted, brutally and completely, by the outbreak of the Second World War and Germany's occupation of Czechoslovakia, during which, according to accounts that have circulated for decades among people familiar with the story, further legal action against a German manufacturer became not just impractical, but genuinely dangerous for anyone associated with pressing the claim. The dispute only finally resolved, with a settlement payment from Volkswagen to Tatra, years after the war had ended, and both companies were, once again, operating in a context where such a claim could be pursued through ordinary legal channels rather than against the backdrop of military occupation. It's a remarkable, often overlooked footnote to automotive history. One of the best-selling cars ever built, in some meaningful engineering sense, has a small Moravian truck company's fingerprints all over its fundamental design. A debt that took literal decades and an entire intervening world war to even begin to formally settle. Then came the war, and then came the same story we've now traced across this entire region on this channel. Czechoslovakia fell first under Nazi occupation, and Tatra's factories, like so much of the country's industrial base, were redirected toward supporting the German war effort rather than continuing to develop new civilian designs. Ledwinka himself, according to accounts that have circulated for decades among historians of this period, faced serious legal difficulty after the war ended, accused by the newly re-established Czechoslovak state of having collaborated with the wartime occupation through his continued technical work at the factory during those years. A fate that, whatever its full details, meant the very engineer whose radical pre-war designs had defined the company's golden era played little to no direct role in shaping what came next, as Czechoslovakia fell firmly into the Soviet sphere of influence and a very different chapter of the company's history began. After 1945, firmly into the Soviet sphere of influence. By 1948, following a communist takeover, Tatra, like nearly every significant industrial enterprise across the country, was nationalized and absorbed into the new centrally planned economy. Unlike some of the companies we've covered previously, though, Tatra's story under communism took a genuinely distinctive path. One defined less by mass-market consumer vehicles for ordinary citizens and more by two very different, almost contradictory identities operating side by side under the very same brand name. Unlike some of the companies we've covered previously, though, Tatra's story under communism took a genuinely distinctive path. One defined less by mass-market consumer vehicles for ordinary citizens and more by two very different, almost contradictory identities operating side by side under the very same brand name. By this point in its history, Koprivnica itself had become, in the same pattern we've seen repeat itself across this entire region, something close to a true company town, its identity almost inseparable from the factory at its center. Generations of families built their entire lives around employment there, apprenticing as teenagers, working their way up through decades of skilled trades, and eventually watching their own children follow the same path into the same gates. This wasn't unique to Tatra, of course. We've seen this exact pattern in Zwickau with the Trabant, in Székesfehérvár with Icarus, but Koprivnica's version of this story stretched back even further than either of those, rooted in an industrial tradition dating not to the mid-20th century, but all the way back to that original 1850 wagon workshop. On one side, Tatra continued building passenger cars, but not for ordinary people. These were large, distinctive, rear-engined luxury sedans, models like the Tatra 603 and later the 613, that became in effect the official transportation of the Czechoslovak Communist Party's senior leadership and state officials. If you saw a Tatra sedan gliding down a Prague street during these decades, the person inside it was, almost without exception, someone with real political power. These cars occupied a strange, almost contradictory position. Engineering marvels built to an extraordinarily high standard, reserved almost exclusively for the very elite of a system that officially claimed to have abolished class distinctions entirely. These cars occupied a strange, almost contradictory position. Engineering marvels built to an extraordinarily high standard, reserved almost exclusively for the very elite of a system that officially claimed to have abolished class distinctions entirely. There's a genuine irony worth sitting with here, one that echoes something we've touched on elsewhere in this series. A political system built on the rhetoric of equality nonetheless found itself maintaining an entire specialized production line dedicated to building large, comfortable, distinctive luxury vehicles for its own leadership. Vehicles that an ordinary factory worker in Koprivnica, however skilled, however central to the actual manufacturing of these cars, would never have any realistic prospect of owning. The Tatra sedan became, in its own quiet way, almost a kind of uniform for state power. Instantly recognizable on the streets of Prague, its unmistakable silhouette announcing, without a single word, that whoever sat inside held some meaningful position within the party apparatus. And this status wasn't confined only to Czechoslovakia itself. Small numbers of these distinctive vehicles found their way to other Eastern Bloc capitals as well, part of the broader pattern of prestige goods circulating among Allied socialist elites. A Tatra sedan gliding past in East Berlin or Warsaw carried exactly the same unmistakable message about the occupant's status as it did back home in Prague. A shared visual language of power that crossed borders even as ordinary consumer goods rarely did. On the other side of the company's operations, and ultimately far more significant to the story we're telling here, Tatra became one of the world's leading manufacturers of heavy-duty trucks, specifically engineered for the most punishing terrain imaginable. And this is where Ledwinka's original engineering philosophy from the 1930s, that central backbone tube, that independent suspension at every wheel, turned out to be almost perfectly suited to an entirely different purpose nobody could have fully predicted decades earlier. Building trucks capable of surviving conditions that would utterly destroy a conventional rigid-frame vehicle. Tatra trucks built through the post-war decades became genuinely, deservedly legendary for their off-road capability. The independent suspension at each wheel meant that even when one wheel dropped into a deep rut or crater, the others remained largely unaffected, keeping the vehicle stable and moving forward in conditions that would leave most conventional trucks hopelessly stuck or physically broken. These trucks were exported not just across the Eastern Bloc, but to militaries, mining operations, and remote infrastructure projects across Africa, Asia, and Latin America. Anywhere that genuinely required a vehicle capable of surviving terrain with no roads at all, only whatever the landscape itself provided. Tatra trucks built through the post-war decades became genuinely, deservedly legendary for their off-road capability. The independent suspension at each wheel meant that even when one wheel dropped into a deep rut or crater, the others remained largely unaffected, keeping the vehicle stable and moving forward in conditions that would leave most conventional trucks hopelessly stuck or physically broken. Picture a Tatra truck grinding its way along a half-collapsed logging road somewhere in the mountains of a country thousands of kilometers from Czechoslovakia, carrying construction materials to a remote mining site with no paved access of any kind. The driver relying entirely on the vehicle's reputation for near-total mechanical reliability, because a breakdown out here could mean days of waiting for any kind of help to arrive. Or picture the same basic vehicle, in a completely different climate entirely, hauling supplies across a stretch of Saharan desert for a military logistics unit, its air-cooled engine indifferent to sand and heat that would clog and overheat a conventional water-cooled design within hours. These weren't showroom vehicles built to impress a buyer standing on a clean factory floor. They were working machines, engineered from the ground up for exactly the kind of punishing, unglamorous conditions where failure simply wasn't an acceptable option. These trucks were exported not just across the Eastern Bloc, but to militaries, mining operations, and remote infrastructure projects across Africa, Asia, and Latin America. Anywhere that genuinely required a vehicle capable of surviving terrain with no roads at all, only whatever the landscape itself provided. Word of this reputation spread the way genuine engineering reputations always do, not through advertising campaigns, but through the accumulated testimony of drivers, mechanics, and procurement officers who had personally seen a Tatra truck keep running in conditions that had already destroyed several supposedly more modern competitors. And then came the moment that turned Tatra from a respected industrial exporter into something closer to a global legend. Its extraordinary run of success at the Dakar Rally, one of the most punishing endurance motorsport events ever created. Originally running from Paris to Dakar in West Africa, hence the name, even after the route later changed, this race sent competitors across thousands of kilometers of desert, rock, mud, and dune, testing vehicles and drivers well past the limits most manufacturers would ever consider reasonable. Interestingly, this wasn't the company's first serious brush with competitive motorsport either. Even back in the 1930s, during the same period Ledwinka's radical passenger car designs were turning heads across Europe, Tatra vehicles had already begun appearing in early European rallying and endurance events, their unconventional engineering occasionally catching rivals and observers by surprise, long before anyone had ever heard of the Dakar Rally. There's a certain pleasing symmetry to the fact that a company whose engineering philosophy was forged, in part, through decades of competitive testing against rivals, would eventually produce, half a century later, some of the most dominant off-road racing machines the world had ever seen. The backbone chassis and independent suspension that had impressed European motoring journalists in the 1930s were, in a very real sense, still the exact same fundamental ideas carrying Tatra trucks across the dunes of Mauritania and Mali more than 50 years later. To appreciate just how improbable this later dominance really was, it helps to understand what the Dakar Rally's truck category actually demanded from a vehicle. This wasn't a smooth racetrack event where engineering advantages translated cleanly into lap times. Competitors drove thousands of kilometers across some of the most punishing terrain on the planet, shifting sand dunes that could swallow a wheel without warning, jagged volcanic rock fields capable of tearing a tire or a suspension component apart in seconds, sudden river crossings, temperature swings between freezing desert nights and scorching midday heat, all while navigating with only rough route notes and a compass, often with no support vehicles anywhere nearby if something broke down in the middle of nowhere. A truck that couldn't absorb genuinely violent, unpredictable terrain shocks without braking simply wouldn't finish the race, regardless of how powerful its engine was or how skilled its driver happened to be. This is exactly the environment Ledwinka's decades-old backbone chassis and independent suspension design, originally developed for entirely different purposes back in the 1930s, turned out to be almost perfectly suited for. Each wheel could absorb a violent impact largely on its own, without transmitting that shock through a rigid axle to the opposite wheel and destabilizing the entire vehicle. Teams from wealthier Western manufacturers, backed by significantly larger budgets, sponsorship deals, and marketing departments, kept arriving with sophisticated, well-funded entries, and kept watching these comparatively unglamorous Czech trucks, with their distinctive rounded cabs and unmistakable engineering pedigree, cross the finish line first, year after year. Beginning in the late 1980s and continuing powerfully through the 1990s and into the early 2000s, Tatra trucks entered in the event's demanding truck category, began to dominate in a way that few other manufacturers before or since have ever managed to replicate. Year after year, competitors from wealthier countries with vastly larger racing budgets, teams backed by major Western manufacturers with far bigger marketing departments, kept losing to these distinctive, rear-engined Czech trucks with their unmistakable, slightly ungainly-looking backbone chassis silhouette. For roughly a decade and a half, Tatra's name became, among rally enthusiasts and truck engineers worldwide, essentially synonymous with the single toughest, most reliable heavy vehicle you could put through the worst conditions on Earth. This success mattered enormously beyond the trophies themselves. Talk to anyone who actually competed against these trucks during this era, and a common theme tends to emerge. A kind of reluctant, grudging respect for a vehicle that simply refused to fail at the moments when failure seemed almost inevitable. Rival teams, arriving with newer, more expensively developed machinery, would watch their own trucks struggle with overheating, suspension damage, or drivetrain failures in exactly the kind of terrain where the Tatra entries kept grinding forward, seemingly unbothered. For a manufacturer whose home country was, at the exact same time, struggling through a difficult and uncertain economic transition, these victories carried a significance well beyond simple sporting glory. For a Czechoslovak, and later Czech, manufacturer navigating an increasingly difficult and competitive global market after the end of communism, Dakar victories were priceless, essentially free international advertising, proof on the world stage that this small company's engineering wasn't some regional Eastern Bloc curiosity, but genuinely world-class by any honest global standard. But here's the almost unbelievable irony sitting at the very heart of this particular story. The detail that makes Tatra's collapse genuinely different from anything we've covered so far on this channel. While these trucks were out in the desert, humiliating far wealthier competitors and building one of the most impressive motorsport legacies in the industry's history, the company itself, back home in the Czech Republic, was tearing itself apart from the inside. The end of communist rule in Czechoslovakia in 1989 and the subsequent Velvet Revolution set in motion the same broad economic transition we've seen play out across this entire region. A rapid, often chaotic shift from centrally planned state ownership toward private, market-based enterprise. Tatra, like so many major industrial companies across the former Eastern Bloc, entered a period of privatization in the early 1990s, a process that, in country after country we've examined, tends to determine whether a legendary industrial name survives into the new market era intact, survives in a diminished form, or doesn't survive at all. Complicating matters further, Czechoslovakia itself split peacefully into two separate countries, the Czech Republic and Slovakia, in 1993, an event known as the Velvet Divorce, a deliberate echo of the earlier Velvet Revolution's peaceful character. While this transition was remarkably calm and cooperative by the standards of how nations usually split apart, it still meant that Tatra, based in the newly independent Czech Republic, had to reorganize its business relationships, supply chains, and traditional markets across what had, until very recently, been considered entirely domestic territory rather than international trade. Complicating matters further, Czechoslovakia itself split peacefully into two separate countries, the Czech Republic and Slovakia, in 1993, an event known as the Velvet Divorce, a deliberate echo of the earlier Velvet Revolution's peaceful character. While this transition was remarkably calm and cooperative by the standards of how nations usually split apart, with none of the violence that accompanied similar breakups elsewhere in the former communist world during these same years, it still meant genuine, practical economic disruption for a company like Tatra. Suppliers, customers, and business partners that had operated for decades within a single, unified domestic market, moving parts and finished vehicles freely across what had simply been internal provincial boundaries, now had to navigate an entirely new set of customs procedures, currency arrangements, and cross-border trade regulations, practically overnight. A component supplier in Slovakia that had shipped parts to the Koprivnica plant every week for years without a second thought about international paperwork suddenly represented an international transaction, subject to entirely new bureaucratic requirements neither side had ever needed to deal with before. This wasn't, on its own, a catastrophic problem. The two new countries maintained close, cooperative relations, and cross-border trade continued largely intact. But arriving in the middle of an already turbulent, broader economic transition, with privatization underway, old Soviet-aligned export markets collapsing, and the passenger car business already in serious trouble, this administrative disruption added one more layer of genuine operational difficulty to a company already straining under considerably larger pressures. The passenger car side of Tatra's business, the elegant, distinctive sedans that had once carried Communist Party officials through the streets of Prague, struggled particularly badly in this new environment. Once the vehicle's entire built-in customer base, essentially guaranteed by their position within the old political system, disappeared along with that system itself, there was no equivalent market demand from ordinary consumers, who increasingly had access to a flood of more modern, more familiar Western European cars entering the market for the first time. Production of Tatra passenger cars wound down gradually through the 1990s, finally ending completely in 1999. A quiet, almost unremarked closure of an automotive lineage that stretched back, in an unbroken engineering tradition, to Hans Ledwinka's radical designs of the 1930s. But it was the truck division, the very same division simultaneously winning Dakar Rally after Dakar Rally, that became the center of the company's most serious existential crisis. And this crisis, unlike everything we've examined in previous episodes, wasn't caused by an external shock like a collapsing customer or a vanishing trading block. It was caused by conflict among the very owners and investors who controlled the company itself. Through the 1990s and into the 2000s, Tatra passed through a bewildering, often bitterly contested sequence of ownership changes, shareholder disputes, and boardroom conflicts. Different investment groups acquired significant stakes in the company at various points, each with different, often directly conflicting visions for how the business should be run, what it should prioritize, and where its profits should ultimately flow. Some of these ownership arrangements grew genuinely acrimonious, with rival shareholder factions publicly disputing control of the board, exchanging accusations of mismanagement and self-dealing, and in several instances taking their disputes into lengthy, damaging legal battles that dragged on for years, consuming resources and management attention that a company genuinely fighting for survival could scarcely afford to lose. Imagine trying to run an engineering-intensive, capital-hungry heavy truck manufacturer, one that requires years of stable, patient investment to develop new models and maintain the kind of manufacturing quality that had made its Dakar-winning reputation possible, while simultaneously navigating a revolving door of ownership groups, each arriving with different priorities, different demands, and sometimes actively working against decisions made by the previous regime. Long-term engineering investment, the kind that had produced genuinely innovative vehicles for over a century under Tatra's name, becomes almost impossible to sustain when management itself doesn't know from one year to the next who will actually be in charge, or whether the current owners are focused on building the company's future or extracting whatever value remains from its past. Through the 1990s and into the 2000s, Tatra passed through a bewildering, often bitterly contested sequence of ownership changes, shareholder disputes, and boardroom conflicts. Different investment groups acquired significant stakes in the company at various points, each with different, often directly conflicting visions for how the business should be run, what it should prioritize, and where its profits should ultimately flow. Try to imagine sitting in a management meeting at the Kopchivnitsa plant sometime in the mid-1990s or early 2000s, trying to plan next year's production schedule, next year's investment in new tooling, next year's hiring, while genuinely uncertain whether the shareholder group currently backing you would still hold control of the board by the time any of those plans actually came to fruition. Try to imagine sitting in a management meeting at the Kopchivnitsa plant sometime in the mid-1990s or early 2000s, trying to plan next year's production schedule, next year's investment in new tooling, next year's hiring, while genuinely uncertain whether the shareholder group currently backing you would still hold control of the board by the time any of those plans actually came to fruition. Now imagine that same meeting happening not once, but repeatedly, across nearly 2 decades, with different faces around the table each time, different accents, different priorities, sometimes different languages entirely, as foreign investment groups rotated through periods of involvement. A factory manager who had proposed a genuinely promising new product line under one ownership group might find that entire proposal shelved or actively reversed once a new set of shareholders took control and decided the previous management's priorities didn't align with their own. Engineers who had spent years developing improvements to the truck line's suspension geometry or engine efficiency sometimes watched years of patient work stall out, not because the engineering itself had failed, but because the capital needed to bring it to production kept getting redirected, delayed, or simply lost in the confusion of yet another change in ownership structure. This is, in its own quiet way, a genuinely tragic kind of waste. Not the dramatic, photographable tragedy of a factory gate closing for the last time, but the slower, less visible tragedy of genuine engineering talent and genuine market opportunity being squandered, year after year, by a leadership structure that could never quite hold together long enough to actually capitalize on either one. Long-term industrial planning, the kind that had allowed Ledwinka's engineering philosophy to be patiently refined across multiple decades earlier in the company's history, becomes almost impossible under these conditions. You can't commit to a 5-year product development program when you're not confident the company will have the same ownership, the same strategic priorities, or even necessarily the same name in 5 years' time. Some of these ownership arrangements grew genuinely acrimonious, with rival shareholder factions publicly disputing control of the board, exchanging accusations of mismanagement and self-dealing, and in several instances taking their disputes into lengthy, damaging legal battles that dragged on for years, consuming resources and management attention that a company genuinely fighting for survival could scarcely afford to lose. Alongside the domestic ownership disputes, various foreign strategic partners and potential investors circled the company at different points throughout these turbulent decades, occasionally opening negotiations that seemed, briefly, like they might offer the kind of stable, well-capitalized ownership the truck division genuinely needed to compete against increasingly sophisticated Western rivals. Some of these discussions produced partial agreements, licensing arrangements, or minority stakes that provided temporary relief. None of them, for years, produced the kind of comprehensive, lasting resolution that might have let Tatra's management finally focus entirely on engineering and manufacturing, rather than on defending its own ownership structure. Each near partnership that fell through, each promising negotiation that collapsed before reaching a final agreement, added one more layer of exhaustion to a workforce and a management team that had already been through more instability than any single company should reasonably have to absorb in one generation. Czech business journalists covering the company through these years described a near-constant atmosphere of uncertainty, with headlines announcing new ownership deals, new strategic partnerships, and new turnaround plans, with almost the same regularity that headlines elsewhere in this series described new owners arriving at Icarus's struggling Hungarian factory. Workers at the historic Koprivnica plant, some from families that had been employed there across multiple generations, stretching back in certain cases to the company's earliest days as a wagon workshop, watched this ownership chaos unfold from the factory floor with a particular kind of weary resignation. They had watched the company survive nationalization after the war, watched it survive the transition away from communism, and now found themselves watching it survive, or perhaps not survive, a seemingly endless sequence of new owners, each arriving with confident promises that rarely seemed to translate into the kind of stable, patient investment the business actually needed. Layoffs came in waves through these years, never quite total, never quite ending the company outright, but steadily thinning the workforce and eroding morale in a way that a single dramatic factory closure, however painful, at least has the mercy of being final. At several distinct points during this long, painful period, Tatra came dangerously close to outright bankruptcy, with production slowing dramatically, waves of layoffs sweeping through the historic Koprivnica plant, and serious, credible doubts emerging in the Czech business press about whether one of the most storied names in world truck manufacturing, a company with an unbroken engineering lineage stretching back over a century and a half, would actually survive into the following decade. Workers at the Koprivnica factory, many from families that had worked there across multiple generations, in a town whose entire identity was built around this single industrial name, watched the ownership chaos unfold from the factory floor, uncertain from month to month whether their jobs or the company's storied name itself would still exist a year later. What makes this particular collapse genuinely distinctive, compared to the East German and Hungarian stories we've told previously, is that there was no single overwhelming external event you can point to as the trigger, no falling wall, no collapsing superpower. Instead, this was a slower, more grinding kind of crisis, driven by internal conflict among the people who were supposed to be protecting the company's legacy, each pursuing their own competing interests rather than working together toward the company's long-term survival. In some ways, this makes it a harder story to tell cleanly because there's no single dramatic turning point, no one unmistakable moment where everything changed. There's simply a long, exhausting decade of infighting that, cumulatively, did nearly as much damage as any sudden external shock could have. And yet, and this is genuinely worth pausing on, because it sets this story apart from both of our previous episodes, Tatra didn't actually die. Not completely, and not permanently. Through the 2000s and into the 2010s, after years of ownership turmoil and repeated brushes with collapse, the company gradually, painfully, stabilized under new ownership arrangements that finally brought a genuine, sustained period of relative calm to its management structure. The historic Koprovnice plant continued operating at a considerably reduced scale compared to its Cold War-era peak, but operating nonetheless, continuing to produce the same fundamental family of rugged, backbone chassis, independent suspension trucks that had made the company's global reputation in the first place. Military and specialized off-road contracts, including continuing orders from Czech and international defense customers, provided a steadier, if smaller, foundation than the company had known during its chaotic post-communist decades. Through the 2000s and into the 2010s, after years of ownership turmoil and repeated brushes with collapse, the company gradually, painfully stabilized under new ownership arrangements that finally brought a genuine, sustained period of relative calm to its management structure. This stabilization didn't arrive as a single dramatic rescue, the kind of clean turning point that makes for a satisfying single scene in a story like this one. It arrived slowly, through incremental improvements. A shareholder dispute that finally resolved rather than dragging on for another cycle, a major military or infrastructure contract that provided a genuinely stable, multi-year revenue base rather than another short-term stopgap. A management team that, for once, managed to stay in place long enough to actually execute a strategy rather than simply survive long enough to be replaced by the next incoming ownership group. The historic Koprovnice plant continued operating at a considerably reduced scale compared to its Cold War-era peak, but operating nonetheless, continuing to produce the same fundamental family of rugged, backbone chassis, independent suspension trucks that had made the company's global reputation in the first place. Military and specialized off-road contracts, including continuing orders from Czech and international defense customers, provided a steadier, if smaller, foundation than the company had known during its chaotic post-communist decades. These weren't the tens of thousands of vehicles a year that a company like Icarus had once produced for the Soviet market. Tatra's post-communist survival was always going to look like something much smaller and more specialized than its historical peak. But smaller and specialized, in this particular story, turned out to be genuinely survivable in a way that Icarus's far larger, far more Soviet-dependent business model never managed to replicate. These weren't the tens of thousands of vehicles a year that a company like Icarus had once produced for the Soviet market. Tatra's post-communist survival was always going to look like something much smaller and more specialized than its historical peak. But smaller and specialized, in this particular story, turned out to be genuinely survivable in a way that Icarus's far larger, far more Soviet-dependent business model never managed to replicate. There's an important structural reason for that difference, one worth pulling out explicitly rather than leaving as a passing comparison. Icarus's entire business had been built, deliberately, around enormous volume for a single guaranteed buyer. That was the whole logic of the Kumikon specialization system that created it in the first place. When that buyer vanished, there was no smaller, sustainable version of that same business model waiting underneath the wreckage. The entire enterprise had been sized for a market that no longer existed, and there was no path back to profitability at any realistic scale. Tatra's truck division, by contrast, had never depended on any single, overwhelming customer in quite the same way. Its reputation had been built across dozens of different markets, different militaries, different mining operations and infrastructure projects scattered across multiple continents, each individually modest, none of them representing anything close to half the company's total business on their own. When the ownership chaos of the 1990s and 2000s nearly destroyed the company from within, there was still, underneath all of that turmoil, a genuinely diversified base of demand for what Tatra actually built. That diversification didn't prevent the crisis. It didn't stop years of layoffs, legal battles, and dangerously close calls with outright bankruptcy. But it meant that once the ownership situation finally stabilized, there was still a real, functioning market waiting on the other side of the crisis, ready to buy trucks from whoever finally got the company's management sorted out. Icarus never had that luxury. Its market didn't just weaken, it disappeared. Entirely and permanently, in a way no amount of internal stability could ever have fixed. Today, Tatra Trucks continues to operate, producing specialized heavy vehicles for militaries, mining operations, and extreme off-road applications around the world, still built around engineering principles that trace directly back to Hans Ledwinke's radical thinking from the 1930s. It's a far smaller operation than it was at its Cold War peak, and its passenger car business is gone entirely, a closed chapter that will never reopen. But unlike the Trabant, whose factory closed for good within 18 months of its greatest cultural triumph, and unlike Icarus, reduced to little more than a faint echo of its former global scale, Tatra survived its own near-death experience. Bruised, considerably smaller but genuinely still standing, still building trucks in the very same Moravian town where this story began back in 1850. So here's where this particular story ultimately lands, and here's what makes it meaningfully different from everything else we've covered in this series so far. The Trabant was killed by the very freedom its own people had spent decades fighting for. Icarus was killed by a political collapse that happened in a completely different country, hundreds of kilometers away, entirely beyond its control. Tatra very nearly killed itself, not through any failure of engineering, not through any lack of demand for its genuinely legendary products, but through years of internal conflict among the people who were supposed to be protecting one of the most storied names in the entire history of the automobile. There's something particularly sobering about that distinction, worth sitting with for a moment before we close this story out. It's one thing for a company to be destroyed by forces genuinely beyond anyone's control, a collapsing superpower, a falling wall, a customer that simply ceases to exist through no fault of the company's own management. There's a kind of grim comfort in that version of a story, because it means nobody involved could realistically have done much differently. Tatra's near collapse offers no such comfort. The trucks themselves never stopped being brilliant. The engineering never stopped winning races against far better funded competition. The demand for genuinely capable off-road vehicles never disappeared. Everything that actually threatened this company's survival happened at the ownership level, among people making decisions about who controlled the business and what they wanted out of it. Decisions that had nothing whatsoever to do with whether the trucks themselves were any good. Think back for a moment to the workers we've met across all three of these stories so far on this channel. The East German family that waited a decade for a Trabant, only to watch its value evaporate the moment they finally got the freedom to choose something better. The Hungarian factory worker in Székesfehérvár, building buses destined for cities across a Soviet Union that vanished before those buses even finished their production run. And now, the worker in Koprivnica, whose own factory's products were, at that very same moment, dominating the most demanding truck race on Earth, while that same worker had no idea from one year to the next whether the company signing their paycheck would still exist, or under what name, 12 months later. Three very different kinds of hardship, three very different causes, but in every single case, ordinary people on the factory floor bearing the weight of decisions made entirely somewhere else, whether in Moscow, in a boardroom in Prague, or in the streets of Berlin. That's a harder kind of failure to watch unfold, and in some ways, a more universally relevant one. Falling walls and collapsing superpowers are rare, historically singular events. Boardroom conflict, competing shareholder interests, and short-term thinking overriding long-term investment are not rare at all. They're one of the single most common ways that genuinely good, genuinely capable companies, in any country, in any era, end up nearly destroying themselves, regardless of how excellent their underlying product actually is. Three industrial giants, all built behind the very same Iron Curtain. Three completely different mechanisms of near destruction, a nation's own hard-won freedom, a distant superpower's sudden collapse, and a slow, grinding war fought entirely within its own boardroom. And in Tatra's case alone, something the other two companies in this series never managed, a genuine, if diminished, survival. If there's one thing this entire series keeps demonstrating, it's that there was never just one way for an Iron Curtain industrial empire to fall. Some were destroyed by forces entirely outside their control, decisions made in distant capitals by people who never once set foot on their factory floors. Others very nearly destroyed themselves, through nothing more than years of infighting among people who should have known better, who had every resource and every reason to succeed, and who simply couldn't stop working against each other long enough to let a genuinely excellent product carry the company forward. Koprivnica today is a far quieter town than it was during Tatra's Cold War-era peak, when the factory's whistle marking shift changes could be heard across much of the surrounding valley. and when a majority of working-age residents either worked inside those gates themselves or lived with someone who did. But the gates are still there, the name is still on the building, and somewhere out in the world right now, in a desert, in a mine, on a military supply route with no paved road anywhere nearby, a truck built on the same fundamental engineering principles Hans Ledwinka worked out nearly a century ago is still doing exactly the job it was built to do. Let us know in the comments which Iron Curtain industrial giant you want us to dig into next, and subscribe because there are plenty more of these stories still waiting to be told.